So in this part, we're going to take the trees and turn them into an object that can be harvested properly, rather than just a simple collision destroying the tree outright. We're going to want to be dealing damage to the tree whenever the axe or other proper tool collides with our harvestable objects. So in order to create that, I'm going to right click in the sample scene and create a new game object. So I will call this Harvestable Object, and we'll create a new prefab from this. I'm going to drop this into the objects harvestable folder, and let's enter into here. So the reason for having a separate game object here is so that we can separate the particle system that we'll add to this harvestable object from the original sprite and original collider and original harvestable script. So the way I had it set up, and there are of course different ways you could do this, is that when the harvestable object, in this case the tree, has consumed all of its resources, then the tree will be destroyed. But this particle system, which is going to be emitting the particles that turn into resource pickups, might have not actually finished sending out all of those pickups when the tree removes itself. So keeping them as separate game objects means you can remove one while the other can still function, if that makes any sense. So let's add a particle system into this. So particle system, and the first thing you're going to notice is that there are pink particles. So hit stop. The reason for that is that in the renderer tab, if we go down to here, that we have no material set. So we need to create a material using a PNG texture. So let's go to the Art Gatherer's Exterior Resources folder if you're using the same pack. Take one of these resources and turn it into a material. You can do that by right-clicking on it, going to Create Material, and then this will create a new material in the folder. So I'm going to call this Material Wood Brown, and I'll change it to Particles, Standard Unlit as the material type. So let's drag in Wood Brown, the texture, into the albedo map, and you'll see kind of a preview for how the material looks up there. But you'll notice that it adds in kind of like black background particles because the rendering mode is set to opaque. So we want to change this to cutout so that we can bring the alpha transparency back in. So now with that set up, we can go to the harvestable object again and bring in the new material. So I'm going to drag this into the material slot, and if we hit play, well, now it's emitting a giant log of wood. Now, obviously, that's way too big, so we need to go to the top up here and change the start size to something much smaller. Like, I think we want 0.16 for a 16 by 16 pixel size. Let me see if this texture is also 16 by 16. Is there a place I can see it? Yeah, 16 by 16, if we expand the preview there. So that should be the right size for the particles. And let's hit play. Okay, so we can kind of see particles being emitted of the right size for the wood. Okay, so to keep things a little bit organized, I'm going to take the materials we create and I'll put them into a new folder. I'm just going to put that in the resources folder here. So I'm going to call it materials, and I'll bring this resource material and any other resource materials into this materials folder. The next thing we probably want to do here is kind of bring back the pine tree as a harvestable object. So I will nest that in the scene. We'll start with that. So we have the pine tree object, which is the actual harvestable object. And then we have the harvestable object on top. So the idea is when the axe hits the tree, the particle system is going to emit these wood particles, which eventually turn into game objects. Particle systems don't create game objects, but there's a trick we can do to create a game object at that position when the particle disappears. And we'll get into that in a second. So to start, let's create kind of a kill zone collider for this tree, which means that whenever it exits this zone, that the particles will be killed off and removed from the particle system. So add a component, circle collider, and let's edit the collider shape. This would actually be easier to see if we're not editing it in the same context. So let's exit out of the prefab mode and double click on the prefab from the project window. That way we can see things a lot better here. So let's zoom in. Okay. Well, we do have to zoom in a lot there. Go back to the circle collider, edit it, and let's shrink the size. Okay, so it's way too big right now. Let's take the size and manually decrease that to something like 0.5. Okay, and we still need to make it smaller. So something around the outside radius of the tree. Let's do 0.25. I think that's a good starting point. Okay, so this collider, basically whenever something is outside of it, it's going to kill off the particle. But you can see that these particles are spawning way outside of the circle to begin with. So let's go to the shape tab of the particle system, enter here, and let's do some settings here. So first off, change the shape to circle. So we have a circle for creating the particles and a circle for killing them off. So the important thing here is that the spawning circle is smaller than the kill circle so that the particles actually spawn within the maximum radius. So take the radius and set it to something like 0.2 or even less than that, 0.15. Okay, so now you can see that the particles are spawning from inside of here. I think I actually want it to be smaller than that. So let's do 0.04 or 0.05, I think is good. Yeah, we can go with that. So now they're spawning from inside of that circle, but their velocity is way too fast. So let's go up to the top, and I'll change the start speed to be much less. Let's try something like 0.5 for right now. That's pretty okay, but let's double that to 1. I think that's pretty reasonable. So now to kill off the particles when they leave this circle, let's go to the triggers tab, expand this, check triggers, and now for this list, we're adding a list of colliders which are going to interact with our particles. You can see that inside is set to kill right now, so I actually want to change that to ignore, because we're not killing the particles inside the circle, but when they're outside of the circle. So take the circle collider and add it to the list here. So add one to the list, takes a component. The component we want is circle collider. And now take the outside and turn it to kill. And now when a particle reaches the outside of our circle collider, it's killed off immediately. So the particles can only exist inside of there. So that's the part for killing them. To create the callback where the game object that looks just like the particle is going to spawn, we use the exit and a callback here. But to have a callback, we're going to have to use a script. So in this case, I'm going to take the harvestable script that is currently on this child game object and move it up to the harvestable object. So I have one script to manage things, but the tree pine part of this is basically going to be the visuals. And when the tree's removed, it's also going to remove the circle collider used for triggering the particles to spawn. So the harvestable script won't be able to create any more particles once this object is removed. So let's take the tree, and I'll also harvestable script removed component apply to tree pine. So this is now just a tree with nothing special about it. Now click on the harvestable object and let's edit the script. So edit script. So the harvestable script so far is really basic, but what we really want the harvestable script to do is not destroy the game object, at least initially, but to spawn particles through this particle system. So to do that, we're going to get access to the particle system. So let's go ahead and do that on start method. So let's write start, and then we're going to do underscore ps for particles. And then we'll do underscore ps for particle system equals get component particle system. And when we have access to the particle system, we can tell it to emit particles. And let's, of course, generate the field for that. So a private field for our particle system. So now when we have harvest being called, let's get a int amount to harvest. And then we'll use that amount to decide how many particles we generate, since the particles will eventually turn into game objects. So we're, in a sense, spawning one pickup resource for every one amount that goes into the harvest function. So let's not destroy it here. I'll comment that out. And instead we do underscore ps dot emit, and we just pass in the amount here. So this would allow us to just continually emit particles whenever it gets hits based on a certain amount, but we do want a limit there, which is going to be the basically total number of resources that our harvestable node holds. So we can create a field to set that up. Just how many things do you want one tree or one rock to be able to spawn? So let's do a field, serialized field for the backing field of a property, and then public float. So we could call this something like, let's say, resource count as a get private set, so that you can, once again, not just randomly change this from another script. So with the resource count, we can check if the amount of resources we've spawned has gone above this resource count, and then if it has, then the node is depleted. So we could set it to a depleted state or just keep it simple and destroy the game object. Let's have a private field for the amount of resources harvested. So private float underscore resources harvested. Of course, this would start at 0, or we could call it amount harvested. Might be a little bit more clear. So whenever we pass in the amount, we can see how many more we are allowed to actually emit from the particle system. So to do that, we need to get the difference between the resource count and the amount harvested. So let's do a integer. And actually, these should really be integer values. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to spawn a partial particle, so we'll just have integer numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no decimal point. So in the harvest function, we'll have the integer amount to spawn, which will be based on a mathf function, and that's going to be mathf.min. So the lower between these two amounts, which is going to be the amount we expected, and the resource count minus the amount that's already harvested. So basically, we can't harvest more resources than are left in the node. So if the amount to spawn is greater than 0, then we can actually emit the amount to spawn. So let's cut this and put it in there. Amount to spawn. And then after we've emitted those particles, then we add that amount that we actually did spawn to the amount harvested. So underscore amount harvested plus equals the amount to spawn. Okay, and up there, get rid of the f. It's not a float anymore, it's an integer. Okay, so after that, and really we could check this regardless of whether or not we did spawn any or not, but if the amount harvested now is greater or equal to the resource count, then the node is depleted. So we're going to destroy a game object in here, but it's not going to be this game object per se. It's going to be the node game object, the one under it, which holds the sprite renderer for the tree or the rock or whatever. So let's get a new field up here, and this will be a public game object, and I'll call this resource node. We'll just have a get. So the only way we'll be able to set this is in the inspector. Don't really need a private set. So let's take the resource node, and we're going to destroy the resource node now. So that will be where we have the collision check for, of course, the tree getting hit. So once it's gone, you can no longer collide with the tree, and you shouldn't be able to cause this harvest function to happen anymore. So since we changed the harvest function, we also need to go to the tool script and give it some value of the amount to harvest. So we could go up here to the top and set something like a minimum maximum harvest values. Eventually this might be in something else like the tool statistics themselves, maybe in a scriptable object. But for right now, let's do a field, serialized field, and let's add in a public int min harvest, and we'll have a get private set, and we'll set the min to 1. And then let's just copy paste this line, and we'll have a max harvest, and let's say that's 3. So we can have a random number between 1 and 3 be the amount we harvest, which is a little bit more interesting, I think, than just always harvesting one material from the node on each swing. So to generate the random number, we want unity engine.random. Let's see, random range, and I believe you can use integers here. So min harvest as the min, and then max harvest as the max. So it looks like we want random.range instead of random range. So now that we have the random number, let's just pass that into the harvest amount. Okay, and now we should be able to go back out. Our scripts compile. We should be able to come back out here and test everything so far. So first off, let's take the emission and take the rate over time and set that to 0 so that the particles are only going to spawn when we actually hit the tree. So rate over time is good for testing, but that's not what we want in the actual thing. And then let's go down here to the harvestable script. So the resource count, we can just default this to something like 5. It looks like for the harvestable script, though, in order to actually set it in the inspector, we have to have a private set. I guess I forgot about that. So add in private set for resource node. Then we come back out again, Okay, and we can set that node. So in the hierarchy, take the tree pine node or game object and assign that to the resource node so it can be removed when the harvestable script runs out of game objects. Okay, so now let's go back to the main scene. I am going to delete the extra trees here. So I'm going to just hold shift down, select them all, delete it from the screen, and move this harvestable object that actually does have the particle emission into position. Let's hit play, and when we walk into the area, we can see that it's emitting particles, which is close to what we want, except that that should only happen when we hit the tree, not when we run into the circle. So what we want to do is make it so that the circle collider actually doesn't interact with the axe in any way, or really any other game object. It's only there for the particle physics. So on the prefab for the harvestable object, go down to the circle collider, layer overrides, and we're going to want to exclude layers everything here, as I believe the setting we need. So let's hit play, go back in, and you can see that now that circle collider does not interact with the axe in any way. But if we go up to the tree, then it's still not doing its thing. Okay, maybe the tree pine doesn't have the other collider. Let me take a look there. Actually, the other thing is that the harvestable script really was supposed to be on the underlying object. My bad. So take the harvestable script and just drag it onto the tree pine. Or if you can't do that, you can just add in the script again on the tree pine node. So let's add in harvestable. So we want 5 here. And for now, I guess we can set the resource node, but we might not need that as a field because we could just have the game object destroy itself. And on harvestable object, we remove the harvestable script. So now this harvestable script will be tied to this game object, not the parent one with the particle system. But since we moved the position of the harvestable script, that means we need to get access to the particle system again. So there's a couple ways we could get the particle system. One that would be quick would just be get component in parent like this. But there's no guarantee that that's going to be exactly the particle system we're looking for. So a more precise way might be to come up here and change the particle system field to a public property. So field serialize field, and let's make this public. I'll call it, let's say, capital PS, and then get private set. I'll actually call this particle system now to be a bit more clear. Okay, so now we don't need to use the start function for that, but we'll be assigning it in the inspector. And we just take the property down here. Instead of underscore PS emit, it's particle system emit. Okay, and you know what? We do want to be specific about which particle system we're using. So I'm going to rename this one more time. And I'll say resource emit PS for particle system. Okay, I think that should be good. Okay, so now in the inspector, we can assign where that resource emit particle system is, which is on the parent game object. We're not going to need the resource node anymore. So let's remove that as a field and just do destroy game object in the script, the harvestable script. And let's hit play and test if we can get those to spawn. So we take the axe over to the tree, and okay, there we have our particles spawning. That's what we want to see. They go away, and the tree also gets destroyed, but the particle system is still going because that's a parent game object. So last thing for this video, let's have a game object spawn at the position where the particles are removed. So to do that, let's create a new folder, I suppose, for resources. So let's right click, create a folder. Yeah, like I guess we'll just call it resources. And I'll create a new game object here. Or actually, let's create it in the scene. So I'm going to right click in the scene, create empty. I'll call this resource wood brown. Okay, and we'll add a component sprite renderer. For the sprite, I'm going to grab the wood brown sprite. And for now, we'll just leave that as the game object. So I'm going to drag this into the resources folder. And then on our harvestable object, let's go into the tree pine where we have the harvestable script. Okay, so lastly, in order to turn the particles into game objects, we want to create another script. I'll call it GameObject emitter, and I'm going to be putting this one on the harvestable object parent node. So add a new script. We'll call it GameObject emitter. Create an add. Okay, in the script, we'll be needing to get access to the particle system once again. And also we're going to need a prefab to spawn. So this will be the pickup resource that we want to spawn. So field, serialize field, public game object. And we could just say pickup prefab or something. So get private set. And let's also get the particle system. So private particle system underscore PS. On start, we'll get that. So this is going to be from the current game object. So just get component particle system. And then get rid of the update function. And the function we need to respond to from the particle system is going to be on particle trigger. So if we take a look at the particle system in Unity, you can see triggers. These are the different triggers. So the one we're going to be reacting to specifically is on exit, and we're going to set that to callback. So set triggers exit to callback. So then we need on particle trigger inside of this mono behavior script. And we want to get all of the particles that are triggering that exit callback. So let's do underscore ps dot get trigger particles. And we want the particles that have the event type exit. So when the particles exit the radius, they trigger this event and we get the callback. And this will give us a list of particles, which we can use to basically go through each particle and spawn the game object at the point where that particle is currently at. So to set the list of particles, let's create one up at the top. So have private list of particles, or hold on, let me see what's that's technically called. Particle system dot particle. So particle system dot particle, and we'll just have a exit particles as the list name, and this will just be a new list. So just initialize it as a new list. And then let's take exit particles, put that in there. So this function is going to fill the list of exit particles, and then we just go through each one and create a game object. So for each particle system dot particle, yeah, can be particle P and exit particles. Sure, why not? Then we're going to create the game object. So let's do game object spawned object equals instantiate on the pickup prefab. But you know what? I'm going to rename pickup prefab just as object prefab, keeping it more generic since this is game object emitter. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with pickups. And then we're going to set the transform position of the new game object to the position of the particle. So spawned object dot transform dot position is going to be equal to p dot position. Okay, and that may be able to work. Let's go ahead, go back out to the game view. Let's scroll down here to see our script. So we need to put the object prefab. I'll select an object from the project and the assets folder. So we want the resource wood brown game object. Okay, and make sure we have exit set to callback on the triggers. Now let's hit play. Let's run into the tree, and we can see that the game objects are spawning, but not necessarily at the same position as the particle. So for the resource wood brown, I'm going to make sure all its X, Y, Z values are set to 0. And let's apply those defaults to the prefab. Okay, maybe we'll just double click into the prefab and hit 0, 0, 0. Okay, yep. Let's go back out, hit play, and see if it's working now. Okay, so they're still spawning away from where the tree is at. But at least for right now, we have the basic idea of spawning the game objects when the particles are removed. So in the next part, we'll work on getting them to be in the right position a little bit more, and then actually making it so we can pick up the resources and other stuff like that.